Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of e-Stewards version 4.1. Today we'll be providing a high-level overview of the changes between version 4.0 and 4.1 and covering some of the associated transition requirements as well. My name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have an agenda on this first slide. We will begin by talking a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We'll cover some of the benefits of certification to a standard such as e-Stewards. We'll cover the transition details as relevant for clients transitioning from version 4.0 to 4.1. Spend the majority of the time covering the key changes between the two versions, and we'll close with time for questions. Feel free to type them in at any point during the presentation, but I will save those for the end. Perry Johnson Registrars is a leading registrar. We're one of the leading certification bodies in the world. We have certified companies to a variety of standards. Our clients are located all around the globe. And while this list is not necessarily all-inclusive, it certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as a certification body. PJR is accredited to grant certifications for a variety of standards, as I mentioned on the previous slide. Today, we are specifically discussing the e-Stewards standard, but some of these other standards may look familiar to you depending on the industry and any other certifications that you may already be familiar with. Benefits of certification vary by standard, by industry, by location. There are a number of factors, but there are typically some common themes for certification given specific standards. Today we are talking about e-Stewards, so some of the most common or primary benefits of certification to the e-Stewards standard include that commitment to preventing illegal handling of e-waste or hazardous waste streams, to protecting data and data security, to maintaining social responsibility and environmental protection efforts. So the primary principles of the e-Stewards standard, by maintaining e-Stewards certification, by being able to advertise that e-Stewards certification, your company is relaying that same commitment. By maintaining certification to e-Stewards, you're able to reduce the organization's environmental, health and safety, data security, and social accountability risks by identifying, quantifying in most cases, and controlling the identified risks. There are a variety of business management drivers, including improvements to public image, again, the ability to advertise that e-Stewards certification. Again, along the lines of advertising here, e-Stewards represents that responsible management of electronics. So being able to advertise that scope or that intention. Maintaining a certification, being able to advertise a certification that not all organizations hold, can provide a competitive advantage. If you're bidding for a contract and your competitors do not maintain e-Stewards certification, that may provide, as I said, a competitive advantage. Being able to advertise that certification makes you stand out, again, thinking along the lines of what the standard and the certification represents, that commitment or that responsible management of electronics. The standard itself, implementing and maintaining the requirements of the standard, provides a framework to be able to meet or maintain compliance with applicable legal requirements, other types of requirements, not necessarily regulatory in nature, but perhaps customer requirements, stakeholder requirements. When we're talking about e-Stewards specifically, one example would be the requirements of the Basel Convention, which are requirements of e-Stewards certified organizations, even if it's not an applicable regulatory requirement given the location of the organization. Version 4.1 of the e-Stewards standard was published on February 22nd. You can follow the links in the slides if you download a copy of them. You can also access the same information through the e-Stewards website, but the e-Stewards website houses a free copy of the standard, version 4.1 of the standard. That's the first hyperlink here. You can also find hyperlinks to the sanctioned interpretations. This is broken into two parts, parts A and B, through the e-Stewards website as well. And that's where you find some details about the specific changes in 4.1. On e-Stewards website, you can also find a copy of the transition plan that e-Stewards published regarding version 4.1 transition requirements. That was published on March 14th, and again houses the expectations or the requirements for clients transitioning from version 4.0 to 4.1. Within the transition plan, you will find deadline information. So deadlines for by which transition audits must take place. The transition plan specifies that any audits scheduled to begin on or after April 22nd need to be conducted to version 4.1 of the standard. We are obviously past that date, so we're no longer conducting audits to version 4.0. Even initial registrations and recertification audits need to be conducted to version 4.1 at this point. Earlier in the transition period, there was a period of time up until April 21st, or up until April 22nd, excuse me, where the audit could go to version 4.0 or 4.1 based on the client's preference and their readiness. So, as I mentioned, any audits taking place now to e-Stewards are to version 4.1. And the transition expectations include implementation of the sanctioned interpretations, both parts A and B. Clients are required to have identified measures or plans to implement the version 4.1 changes. The transition plan for e-Stewards version 4.1 allows transition audits to occur on-site or virtually if the client is a good candidate for virtual auditing techniques. It does not necessitate that the transition audit be conducted during a recertification audit. Instead, they are identifying that all audits beyond a certain date are to version 4.1. So if you fall within a surveillance audit in that period of time, your transition audit can take place during the surveillance audit. Time could potentially be added to an audit to ensure all the transition requirements are covered. The overall deadline for all e-Stewards certificates to transition is April 22nd of next year. So over the period of April 22nd, 2022 to April 22nd, 2023, all e-Stewards audits we already know are being conducted to version 4.1. So we need to make sure that audits are scheduled in accordance with this overall deadline, especially if your audit is typically taking place Q1 or even really early Q2. We want to make sure that that transition audit is scheduled in enough time to adhere to this overall deadline. We recommend specifically that if you are due in 2023 to transition, that your audit take place by February 1st. That may be a little bit earlier than usual, to ensure that we're able to process the certificate without a lapse and adhere to the overall transition deadline. So February 1st is our recommended deadline for the audit to take place if it hasn't already taken place by then, to allow for all the activities that occur post-audit, closing of any identified NCRs, and the technical package review that takes place, all of the steps involved in certificate decision making and certificate issuance behind the scenes. To get into the key changes in version 4.1, we are assuming that most of the people tuning into this webinar are already familiar with the e-Stewards standard. Most would be transitioning clients, so clients that are already certified to version 4.0, getting ready to transition to version 4.1, and thus having a solid understanding of e-Stewards. You may need to tune back into previous webinars of a more generalized nature to cover e-Stewards at a higher level. So for certified clients, for transitioning clients, we're talking about the key changes in version 4.1. Version 4.1 accepts RIOS certification as a prerequisite certification. Previously, the only option was ISO 14001. Now, our clients get to decide whether they want RIOS certification or ISO 14001 certification to meet the e-Stewards prerequisite criteria. The definition of an e-Stewards processor has been revised in version 4.1 to clarify that control, the concept of control, and that is capitalized as a term, a defined term as well. So to clarify that control extends even to electronic equipment not subject to processing. And I want to take a moment to remind everyone listening that the sanctions interpretations go into a bit more detail as to the nature of these changes or the impact of these changes, and in some cases even the source of or reasoning behind these changes. So we've got a revised definition of an e-Stewards processor. We also have a revised definition of problematic components or materials, also known as PCMs. This revised definition removes PVCs, which are actually an HEW and are already listed in the Basel Convention Annex. So this was essentially redundant. There's a new definition for a processing facility that includes mobile processing, sampling, its applicability to multi-site schemes, and the impact on the requirement for relevant organizations within the e-Stewards organization to be required to achieve certification. So the impact that that processing facility definition has on the requirement for certain organizations to also achieve certification. Again, if you're already familiar with e-Stewards, you're familiar with the requirement to have all e-Stewards organizations within the country certified as well, if they fall within that requirement. So this definition of processing facility may impact instances of multiple locations. Transboundary movements is clarified in 6.1.3.1. Specifically, the clarification comes from e-Stewards limitations. Obviously, the standard can't dictate governmental processes or expectations. So in 6.1.3.1, we see clarification that acknowledges those limitations. E-Stewards can't dictate that governments require prior informed consent if the country or countries don't determine a specific waste to be hazardous or even controlled. That may not apply to everyone, but certainly you can find that in 6.1.3.1 and again get a little bit more detail within those sanctioned interpretation documents. The performance verification program criteria have been revised and added to. You can find that in 6.1.4. As a certified e-Steward organization, you're already going to have a performance verification program, but you'll look at these revised criteria and adapt your program if necessary. (8.5.1b) has been revised in regards to the requirements for batteries destined for reuse. And this is to align with changes in version 4.1 to the definition of repurposing. It's not a significant change to the definition of repurposing, but it did necessitate some clarification in how that is applied to batteries. And continuing along the concept of batteries and direct reuse, in 8.5.1b3, we find a new section that allows for the direct reuse of batteries without testing in very specific instances. And we're talking instances where testing the batteries would present a significant risk, and specific criteria also have to be met. And still on the theme of repurposing, there's also a new section in 8.5.1.1 focusing on this new concept of repurposing, or this changed definition of repurposing, to align with that revised definition. It clarifies that in some cases, repurposing could constitute direct reuse and requires that concept to be used in conjunction with the e-Stewards functionality requirements and the transparency requirements. So it's not a loophole there. 8.5.2 houses clarification regarding qualified smaller components that will ultimately be tested by an IDP. 8.6.1a includes clarification regarding conditionally allowable options. So this revision specifies what the expectations are to demonstrate approval has been obtained. And as you know, as an e-Stewards certified organization, we're talking about approval on the part of the e-Stewards administrator. 8.8.2.1 and 8.8.2.3 include revisions to criteria for non-e-Stewards downstream processors. We see the need to maintain the necessary criteria to process and or dispose of all the organization's materials of concern, as well as removal of the requirement for all downstream processors in the recycling chain to have closure plans. This would just pertain to immediate downstream processors now. Verbiage has been added to Section 8.9 regarding data security. NAID AAA certification transitions as well. And these revisions come in part to clarify the requirement for e-Stewards organizations to be protecting data when received, even if the upstream or the customer may be claiming that it's been sanitized or it has already been sanitized. The exception to that would be instances where the customer maintains ownership throughout the process. So it's very possible in a customer ownership situation that they don't want the contents wiped because it's going to be returned to that same working environment. And that requires specific controls and is an exception to the rule. Earlier in the webinar, I mentioned sanctioned interpretations A and B, and I'm just going to highlight the difference between the two to maybe save you a little bit of time if you're looking for something specific. They do break up the changes across the two documents. So sanctioned interpretation A focuses primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on the changes in the body of the standard, including the definitions, but not so much the appendices. There are some overlap in the changes because some of the changes affect multiple sections of the standard. Sanctioned interpretation B, on the other hand, focuses primarily on the changes within the appendices. Again, there is some overlap and there are some exclusions there. I also noted that sanctioned interpretation B focuses almost exclusively on lost my train of thought, the change to accept RIOS in lieu of ISO 14001 certification. So you see those changes reiterated in several locations, everywhere throughout the version 4.0 standard where it referred to ISO 14001. Now we see revised verbiage to acknowledge both of the acceptable prerequisite standards. Since the bulk of this webinar is focused on already certified organizations and working pretty heavily on the assumption that the organizations are already certified to e-Stewards version 4.0. I didn't remove the overview of the certification steps from these slides, but I'm going to skip through them very quickly. Again, the intent of this webinar is primarily for certified organizations getting ready to transition from one version to the other. You can certainly reference the content of the slides or tune into other webinars that go into more detail about the registration steps for clients pursuing certification for the first time. So here we provide a general overview of the steps for initial certification. This is not specific to the transition process. This is for new clients pursuing certification for the first time. And we go into a bit more detail as to what the stage 1 and stage 2 audits include and what the surveillance and recertification audits look like subsequent to the initial certification. So if you haven't already typed any questions in, go ahead and work on that now. I'm going to go to the final slide that has my contact information should you have any questions you'd like to discuss offline. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. I can be reached by email or phone. If you are a new client looking for a quote for initial certification, I've included the sales department contact number as well. They can get you started, collect some of the information that they'll need to quote audit time and audit costs for initial certification. Let's see what questions we might have so far. I don't see any questions at this time. I will hang out for another moment or two in case someone is typing. It doesn't let me see if you're typing, so I don't want to cut anyone off. But if you don't have any questions, thanks for joining us today. I hope the information is helpful as you prepare for your transition audit to version 4.1. And again, feel free to contact me via phone or email should you have any subsequent questions. Today's webinar is being recorded. I did neglect to mention, so a recording of today's webinar and a copy of the slides will be available through PJR's website. Since there aren't any other questions, I will log off. I hope you have a great day. And again, I hope the contents of the webinar is helpful. Feel free to tune back in for future webinars on a variety of subjects. Have a great day.